COVID-19. It has deepened the inequalities in our societies, created recessions in our economies, and has highlighted the accelerating climate emergency threatening our planet. Around the world, millions of jobs have been lost, and pre-existing racial and gender injustices have been made even worse. It is a moment in our history that has turned risk into a reality, but it has also brought infinite opportunity. 50 years ago, economist Milton Friedman argued that companies exist purely to maximise shareholders' profits. Today, CEOs of some of the world's largest companies are openly questioning the principle of shareholder primacy.
If we succeed, will there be economic growth that's broad spread? Will the economic growth be inclusive?
Microsoft's Satya Nadella called for a referendum on capitalism, urging businesses to grade themselves on the wider economic benefits they bring to society rather than just their profits. He said that Microsoft and others should measure their success by the jobs they create, the revenue they generate for their suppliers, and the money their employees spend elsewhere.
When you do well, the world around you does well.
The COVID-19 pandemic has opened a window to new ideas around how we might shape our future, challenging the status quo. Businesses and workers have abandoned practices that were always considered essential, from working in an office to frequent air travel, and increased attention has been focused on the rights of those at the bottom of the supply chain and those who kept the economy going while the world went into lockdown. So how can we harness this moment of radical disruption to reboot the system and make our economic systems more fair, inclusive, and sustainable? Some countries have started to reassess relationships between the public and private sector, with the goal to spur a green recovery, one that will reduce carbon dioxide emissions, create environmentally friendly jobs, and set strict requirements for future government bailouts. Austria made its bailouts for airlines conditional on the basis that they adopt climate targets. France introduced a 5-year target to increase production of electric and hybrid cars. And New Zealand dropped GDP for a wellbeing budget.
We have embedded well-being at every stage of the creation of this budget,
putting housing, environment, mental health and child poverty first. The path to pandemic recovery is long and winding. So what could the future hold? Is a global transition to sustainable and inclusive economies possible? Will we be able to capitalise on this unique moment in time? Or will we return to business as usual?
It's now time for our first live panel discussion. Together, we'll be exploring practical ways to build a fairer and more sustainable post-COVID recovery. Please welcome David Craig, Livia Firth, Danny Sriskandarajah and Ian Goldin. This session is moderated by James Irungu Mwangi and is in partnership with the Skoll Foundation.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good day, good afternoon, wherever you may be, and welcome to this first panel of this conference and this conversation around what it means to build back better. Over the next hour, I will have the enviable task of engaging our esteemed panelists in a conversation about how we go beyond buzzwords. And kind of a high-level overview of what that means to really get into the hard questions of what will it actually mean for us to forge a more inclusive and sustainable economy coming out of this moment of nearly unprecedented crisis. Building on some of the challenges of Professor Yunus's opening remarks about the 3 zeros and aspiring to a world without wealth inequality and wealth concentration. A world of zero carbon emissions and a world of zero unemployment. So I can't think of a better group of individuals to have this conversation with than my panelists, Livia, Danny, David, and Ian. And we will start with you, Ian. as a professor of globalization and development at Oxford, you spent a lot of time looking at the broader state of the world. And I would imagine you've been pretty busy in the last few months, just reckoning with all of the various moving pieces of this current moment of crisis. Where are we right now? What is the state of challenge? What are the big trend lines that we all need to be thinking about if we are indeed serious about building back better?
Thank you very much, James, and thank you to the Thomson Reuters Foundation for hosting this important conversation. We are at a time which is an inflection point in history. Change is being compressed. What would have taken place over decades is going to take place over the coming year or so. And so it's absolutely vital that we discard old ideas quicker and take on new commitments. Taboos that would have seemed absolutely sacrosanct in January of this year were broken by February. Governments increasing their deficits to 10 to 20%, taking on debt which has been unprecedented in peacetime, controlling businesses, telling us to stop flying, changing our behavior. And while this has all been absolutely vital and necessary, the real disaster would be if we do bounce back to where we were, because business as usual is what got us to where we are. And a continuation of business as usual, and normalization, which we all yearn for, would take us back to a more dangerous and dystopian future. So we need to think very deeply about what are we prepared to change? What practical changes are we prepared to engage in? What this pandemic has revealed and exacerbated is the stark inequalities. Different places, different people, the top 20% of income earners have seen that the incomes have gone up because asset markets have gone up and they've been able to carry on work, whereas the bottom 50% have seen a desperate decline in their incomes. And this takes place for places as well, which have been more locked down in poorer places where deaths have been higher. It's, as Danny will, I'm sure, explain, been devastating for development, the worst development disaster of our lifetime. So inequalities within countries and between countries growing. Of course, between the young and the old too. The young have inherited massive debt. They're taking on new responsibilities for the future. They've lost many of their job prospects. They've lost much of their education, particularly for school kids, but even universities, and they're losing their social life. And there's real crisis of loneliness amongst many people as well. So this is devastating in all respects, and governments must commit, as they did in the Second World War, to give people a better life, a better future, better prospects. One of the worrying aspects as well is that the stimulus plans which have been engaged in are going to lead to an acceleration of emissions. Far from this being good for the environment, it has been only in the short term. And so it's vital when we think about the new building back, we build a Green New Deal, as the European Union, South Korea, and a couple of places are doing. But the overwhelming majority of countries are going to put the stimulus into cement, into steel, and into very high fossil intensive production. So it's vital that we think very differently about this in the future. Practically, what this means is that we're going to have to transfer the solidarity we've expressed to people through clapping, through caring, into concrete actions. Are we prepared to pay essential workers more for the risky jobs they do? Are we prepared to pay taxes at higher levels? Are we prepared to close tax havens? Are we prepared to engage in these sorts of practical activities in terms of changing our behavior to reduce fossil fuels, not fly again when flying is permissible, certainly cutting back on business travel? All of these are questions which we need to face. And when we think about the office as well and going back, we also need to think particularly not so much as how those of us that can work effectively from home will do, but also how we're going to overcome discrimination, engage in apprenticeship of young people, and be a more inclusive society going forward. So a wide raft of activity that forces us in this period of lockdown in the UK to think very deeply and widely around the world how we're going to come out of this.
Thanks, Ian. And I'll take the segue you offered, because you pointed out the huge impact on development of this current moment. Danny, as CEO of Oxfam Great Britain, you spend a lot of time thinking about how the most vulnerable populations among us are being impacted by this crisis, and indeed a whole range of other challenges. Where are we right now? What is the actual state of play with regard to inequality and the particular challenges of those most likely to be left behind in this K-shaped recovery?
Thanks, James. Look, I think we're in a very worrying place. As Ian has said, rather than COVID being the great leveler, as many people said it was going to be, because all of us around the world are equally likely to be infected, we are seeing effectively the great reversal in some of those hard-won progress that we've made on poverty and inclusion. So, we're estimating that around 500 million more people will be pushed into poverty as a result of COVID, that more people will die this year as a result of hunger because of COVID disruptions than from the disease itself, from the infection. And this was brought home to me very clearly early in the pandemic. In fact, from a taxi driver who works in Nairobi, who sent a text message to a colleague of mine who said, "This virus is going to starve us before it infects us." And I think the sad reality is that the impact of the disruptions are being felt unevenly. If you're a garment worker in Bangladesh and the orders of your factory have been cancelled, you probably have no income, and worst of all, you don't have the sort of social protection that many of us in the West have been fortunate to be able to draw down upon. And of course, meanwhile, at the other end of the economy, we've seen windfall profits, excessive profits from the winners of COVID. The world's 32 largest companies have seen their combined profits increase this year by over $100 billion. Jeff Bezos, the owner of, or the founder of Amazon, if he paid every one of his 800,000 staff members $100,000 bonus, he'd still be richer than he was at the beginning of this pandemic. And so the sort of inequities that ran through our economy before COVID are being exacerbated by the disruption that we're seeing of this pandemic. And it's not just economic, it's gender inequality. It's the fact that women are at the front line of some of the worst impacts of COVID because 70% of our healthcare workers around the world are women, or because of what's happening in terms of really rising levels of domestic abuse. It's the digital divide. My family and I have benefited from having access to the internet. My kids have been able to continue to learn despite the disruption. And yet 82% of children in Africa today don't have access to the internet. And so COVID is deepening those digital divides. And of course, just let me close by saying that even when it comes to the way out, there's, I'm relieved to have heard the news this week that there is a viable vaccine. That's fantastic news. It has 90% efficacy, we're being told, but it'll have 0% efficacy for those people and countries who won't be able to pay Pfizer and others a market price to be able to access the vaccine. So we are in a deeply worrying moral moment, I think, in human history, where the very mechanism that will take us out of this pandemic is likely to be determined by a sort of free market approach. And I hope that we really take the opportunity to create some sort of people's vaccine where we can equitably share access to vaccines or treatments that might come down the line. So if we're going to go beyond the buzzwords, we need to go to the heart of the inequities and injustices of the global economy before COVID, and of course exacerbated by COVID.
Thank you, Danny. Your point around the experience in Kenya, for example, really resonated. I live in Nairobi, and I remember observing the way in which COVID was an economic crisis before it was a health crisis for the large majority of the world as they figured out how to contain themselves. And now they're dealing with this double hit, exactly as you say. You made the point around just how bizarrely divergent the outcomes of this pandemic have been for the biggest companies and the biggest pools of capital versus the majority of the world's population in terms of economic prospects. David, as CEO of Refinitiv, you spend a lot of time really understanding what is happening and how, with capital markets and how the world of capital is evolving. And the question is, are there any instruments or tools that come to hand, or trends that might help counteract or in some ways dampen what is, just clearly an unsustainable dynamic that we're heading into or continuing?
Well, thank you, James. Good morning. Good morning to everyone. And thank you to the Thomson Reuters Foundation. I've attended this conference for many years on the key issues of global society. Danny called out many of them. And I don't think anyone expected, or maybe some people did, that we would have a conference like this with the crisis that we have today. But I think, as been said by the other panelists, this is not one crisis, but several at the same time. A crisis in climate, in society, in inequality, a crisis in food, nature and supply chains and biodiversity, and that COVID has triggered and exacerbated many of that. And as Ian, I think, said, this is not build back, and it's certainly not build to business as usual. I don't think anyone would say we're operating in business as usual, and particularly with our perspective on the financial markets, it's far from it in any sense. So Refinitiv, we're a data and infrastructure leader in financial markets. We have a position overseeing market activity in 190 countries through traders, investors, the sovereign wealth funds. And we look at the lens of what the data is saying, what is the news and insights on financial markets, what is happening literally every day. Has been extraordinary activity. And I thought it'd be useful just to play a sort of open a lens on that. And of course, the lens of this too is one of which, financial markets will play a key role in fixing some of these issues. Ian mentioned the debt financing and the level of debt, but the investing focus, the recovery funds, and infrastructure. And I do congratulate Thomson Reuters for the timing of this conference, right after the Biden election and a COVID vaccine emerging. And you saw the financial markets reaction to that. It was extraordinary. The all country index hit a record high. Trillions of dollars of value were increased on the market. Some airlines, leisure and other things, equities were up 30 to 50%. Now you can question whether the markets are over exuberant or even disconnected, as Danny was saying, to reality. And I think the problems that we have will take more than, as they say, a shot in the arm. And it's not even sure how the shot in the arm will work, how it gets transported. And so there's a lot of euphoria and relief, but there's many things to get resolved before this crisis is open. There's a couple of things happening already, just some observations that we have, in addition to things like the EU's 500 billion euro fund. But right when the crisis started back in February and March, we saw access by financial institutions to our ESG data increased by 5 times. And we were quite curious about why that was happening. And it would seem that there was a pent-up demand as the investors were rebalancing their funds in the crisis. They were rebalancing away from carbon-intensive companies and activities, and away from those and towards less carbon-intensive and transitionary finance. We talked in January about a carbon correction move of 4 trillion of the financial markets. It took the COVID crisis to actually trigger it. And we're seeing sustained engagement and involvement and downloads of that ESG data right now and today as well. We've seen record green bond issuance in Q3, a record of nearly $80 billion. We've seen sustainable bonds, nearly $150 billion, double that 12 months ago. We're seeing banks compete with each other for honors in the green and sustainable finance league tables, nothing like a competition and awards to get the bankers excited. But it's very interesting now how they're competing for the kudos of being the leaders in issuing sustainable bonds and sustainable finance. And if we look at infrastructure, which is going to be a key part of the recovery, but also a key part of fixing some of the issues we have, we track about 30,000 of the world's largest infrastructure projects in our database, something like $60 trillion. Around a third of those are now renewable. That gives you real hope and sign that a lot of focus and investment is shifting towards green energy, renewable projects, solar, tidal wind and other things. That's the good news. The bad news is it's a very small percentage of the total investment. It's about 2 trillion of the 60 trillion. So there is a long way to go, but you can really start to see a shift. And one of the other areas that's growing really quickly is the amount of investors that are now using us and others and our risk products to screen their investments and screen their supply chains. So they're really starting to look deep for risk in social risks, in green crime, in environmental violations, animal trafficking, human trafficking, and those areas too. So the markets are really shifting. There's a big hill ahead of us. It is probably the top topic, if not the top 3 topic of every conversation I have with our clients around the world about sustainable finance and these other areas. So there's definitely a big shift happening. I think it's a long way before I think the market exuberance gets met by the reality of the recovery, and also recognizing there's many other challenges we have to fix as well.
Thanks, David. You touched on supply chains, and I think there's a couple of things to come back to in that overall picture, particularly we tend to talk a lot about the sheer rising number of green bond issuances, ESG commitments, et cetera. But as you rightly pointed out, as a share of the total, and in line with Danny's point, and I think Ian's point earlier, as a share of the total, the preponderance of capital is still focused in some ways on business as usual. And we'll come back to what might it take, or are we beginning to see signs that will shift in any sort of meaningful way? But where you left off was touching on supply chains. And Livia, as creative director and founder of EcoAge, you spent quite a lot of time looking at how exactly supply chains work around the world and how they interact with people, as well as what can be done to create supply chains that are good for people and planet at the same time, as well as for profit. What is your reflection on what are the practical examples we can draw on of things that have worked, or maybe negative examples of things that haven't worked in this moment of reflection and hopefully re-engagement?
Well, thank you, James. I love what Ian said at the beginning when he pointed out that we need to discard, our ideas very quickly, because everything we knew worked before is not going to work now. And we need to look at new visions now, and understanding what changes need to happen, which actions we need to take. But I want to take a small step back because in my work, in my experience, and looking at, as you said, I travel many supply chains. And I always told stories about them because I think one of the most powerful tools that we have right now to inspire, to action the change is our imagination and a new storytelling. I was very inspired this year by a book that Rob Hopkins, the co-founder of the Transition Town and Transition Network in England, wrote. It's a book called From What Is to What If, Unleashing the Power of Imagination to Create the Future We Want. And Professor Yunus spoke about it, gave the bigger picture right now. And I think that, what Rob Hopkins tells is that there is plenty of evidence that things can change, that cultures can change. We can change rapidly, dramatically, unexpectedly for the better. He has seen it with what he has done, the work of Totnes in England, for example, where he had an entire community becoming its own housing developer, energy company, enterprise incubator, local food network, with cascading benefits, not the community. So we do have the capacity to affect this change, as Hopkins argues, but we are failing because we are largely allowed our most critical tool to languish, which is human imagination. Imagination is central to empathy, to creating better lives, to envisioning and then enacting a positive future. So what if we become better storytellers? No? So he says, if you want to reach the majority of the population, which right now we do need, you have to create a better dream that can be accessed at all sorts of different points and then go on there with you. And so what unlocks this possibility is the story. People right now, I think, are very tired and very scared of facts. And I'm not sure they need more facts, but they need a new story. So change their story and they will change their behavior. Even Christiana Figueres pointed it out when she said that, we tend to think that, saving the planet as we associate it with salvaging certain iconic ecological features like polar bears, whales, glaciers. So, but the sentiment is really worthy in many ways, but also it leaves us feeling that the problem is out there, is unrelated to our daily life. And this is where at EcoAge we always use fashion. And this is where fashion supply chain can teach us a lot. Why we use fashion as a lens through which to look at the world. For many reasons, fashion is an all-spectrum industry. from agriculture to communication. It has one of the biggest environmental impact. It's one of the biggest employer of slave labor worldwide, which the Thomson Reuters Foundation knows very well. And if you are surprised about that, just let's remember that we all get dressed every single day, right? None of us goes around naked. So hopefully this will help us put things in perspective. But also fashion is, if you're looking for a spectacular narrative, right? One that follows the twists and turns of globalization, for example, and that governs the flow of human and natural capital and wealth, you need fashion, because no sector tells the tale of globalization, just like apparel. And no people tell the truth about globalization like fashion people, from cotton growers to the garment workers when they are listened to, which is rare. And many of them I met in my travels. So this is a story of inputs from across the globe. You know, a design might come together in Scandinavia, only to be made in Vietnam, from cotton grown in Pakistan, house in Dubai, with metal fasteners produced in China. The variables are endless. But, you know, one thing is certain, fashion is on the front line of pretty much everything. So if we use this powerful thread to weave stories, and if I have to relate to, you know, you asked me to, you know, what worked and what didn't. Well, you go to Bangladesh, and I made movies about that too. And you see an entire country, an entire population enslaved by the fast fashion brands who go there to produce in the name of, you know, development, they call it development, and to give an opportunity to people who otherwise wouldn't have a job. But in fact, what happens is that they dictate their conditions. They do not place, you know, they just place an order in a factory. They don't hire the factory. They don't hire the garment workers, you know. And now with COVID, we saw, you know, it's been exposed the harsh reality of this, where there are thousands of garment workers now that are not even being paid. But then last year I went to Botswana, for example, to look at the diamond supply chain. And I was expecting to find something even worse than fast fashion in Bangladesh. And instead, I found something that completely changed my perception and gave me almost like a blueprint of what can work properly. Because here you have diamond companies that actually have made a partnership, a serious partnership with the government and civil society. So 80% of everything they mine goes back to the government, to the country of Botswana, to create infrastructure and build schools and, you know, hospitals. And the people who work in the diamond supply chain, not only they are all, you know, they have a social ladder, a work ladder, they're also incredibly proud to be working there. So I look at the two models, and I know today for certain what works 100%, and what, even if it's not perfect, what can be the beginning of a new way of making business, and that benefits civil society as well, and what doesn't at all, which is the Bangladesh example.
So let me pick up on this question of a new narrative and the power of narratives and stories. It's interesting that you talk about Bangladesh that way. I mean, I spend a lot of time with African policymakers who are saying, well, how can we become the next Bangladesh and attract all of those textile jobs to our country, etc. Ian, I'm sure you have a view on that in how we think about what is development. But I also want to come back to you, Ian, with you know, more from the perspective of this notion of a different narrative. All of us on this panel, and I expect many of those watching, would nod to the idea that we don't want to build back to where we were, the point that you made at the outset. And I think the practical question is, what does a different narrative look like? What are the first 2 or 3 steps in that story that we will know in 2021 we're on the right track if this is happening and not that? Or we'll know we've taken a turn if these continue to be the dominant narratives and not those. Do you have a view on that could maybe help us start to challenge what or set out what the narrative is that we want to get together around?
Yeah, thanks very much, James, and to my fellow panelists. I think I'm very taken by Arundhati Roy's view that this could be a portal to a new world, and that we really are at, I think, in our lives, the most significant moment. And so stepping into the unknown and into a different future is always nerve-wracking, and particularly because the pandemic has raised all our anxieties, and we all want to basically be able to get back to our previous lives. But we need to really deeply recognize, and I think for me, this will be the signal, that this pandemic was absolutely inevitable. You know, I've been saying it every year, written books about it, but many others have as well. And not only is it inevitable, but so is climate change, growing inequality, a dystopian future, geopolitical tensions, and a whole raft of other risks that we face. And if this can be a wake-up call, if we can recognize the inevitability of this, that the globalization has been a most progressive force in the history of humanity, it's brought more progress more quickly to more people than anything, but it's also the most dangerous force. And if it's not regulated and controlled, it leads to rising systemic risks, and the pandemic is an illustration of that. This has actually been a relatively mild pandemic, nothing like the Spanish flu in its virulence and its mortality, and things could get a lot worse, but we have lots of other threats. And those that think that a high wall will protect them need to recognize that Miami will be underwater in 50 or 60 years' time through the melting of the various ice caps. And, you know, there's no wall high enough that will protect you. So for me, the narrative is really a question about, do we recognize our interdependency and that how fragile this system is and how unstable it is? Inevitably, the rich might get richer, and you know, they might be feeling quite comfortable, but their children will live on a totally perilous planet, and they will too. Signs that we can look to, well, you know, I think what we've seen in the US in the last days is a very strong sign, but we clearly populism is being defeated in many countries. It's not about democracy versus autocracy, it's about effective governments, and where the governments have the ability to control the pandemic. And it tends to be the woman-led governments that have been most effective by far around the world, which is very, very interesting. But, you know, President Trump still got 71 million votes, 7 million more votes than he got in his first round. We need to understand that, and just like the financial crisis gave us Brexit, it gave us Trump, it gave us populism because of rising anger and inequality. This is going to exacerbate inequality. So for me, the signs are we prepared to do something serious about inequality, which means close tax havens and pay more tax and redistribute more, build and guarantee minimum incomes. I don't believe in universal basic income. That's a whole nother conversation, but guaranteed minimum incomes. Are we prepared to do something more rapidly about climate change in our stimulus packages? Are we going to make the WHO the fighting force to stop the next pandemic? It can do that. There's no reason for another global pandemic, but we need to build the resource and capability in the WHO. Are we prepared to give the IPCC and climate agreement real teeth? Is the WTO going to create fair rules around it? And I hope they're going to appoint Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who's been nominated by everyone except the US, to be the head of the WTO. These are the early signs we're going to see. And a Cold War between the US and China is not going to get us anywhere, because there's no global problem we can think of, whether it's pandemics, climate change, financial crises, or anything else, that is not going to require China and the US and Europe to work together. So unless we are prepared to work together across the world, then we're back to business as usual. So these are, for me, the signs. Are we prepared to work with people we don't like sometimes to overcome our shared problems while not losing sight of the concerns, whether it's the Uyghur people or Hong Kong or what's happening? We still have to be able to develop a basis for dealing with our common problems.
David, Ian's prescription of some of these steps, you know, some of those things have been on the global agenda for a while, and they very often ran smack into both the political power and the mobilization of concentrations of capital. So the big deployers of capital, big business, etc. You have your finger on the pulse of that world. is there a deal to be had on any of these questions, in your view, right now?
Yeah, I mean, as Ian was speaking, I was thinking there's obviously a debate around is the financial system, and by that I mean the broader system, including government and those international parties. Is the financial system part of the problem or part of the solution? And we can have that debate. I mean, clearly, on climate, for example, it's clear that the financial system has funded over the last 150 years investments which have ignored a true price of carbon, and that was one of the reasons why we argued that if you truly price carbon in, you'd get a very, very different outlook of investment flows and investments. And in fact, global regulators and central banks around the world, many of them now are starting to demand that companies do price carbon in. So a couple of thoughts. One is, unlike the financial crisis, the good news is the financial system has actually been very resilient so far through this crisis. It has survived, it is operating well. There's clearly challenges around debt levels, about defaults in loans, all sorts of issues, but the financial system is operating through this crisis, probably thanks to the previous financial crisis where a lot of work was done on balance sheets, shoring up capital, resilience, and other areas. But most people are actually quite thankful that through the crisis, and frankly, everyone working from home as well, it went through. So the question then is, well, how can it be put to work on some of these issues, and how can we change the way that investments are happening for that? One of the interesting observations that I've seen in the last couple of years is, in particular, the pension funds, which of course are long investments, have realized that there's no point in them investing in companies that don't have long-term sustainability, because these pension funds are meant to give 20 to 30-year returns. And so a lot of the push and the shift that we've seen about where the money is running has been actually oriented from state and government and also corporate pension funds, which have taken a long view. There's a radical change happening in private equity at the moment, which controls, of course, a lot of investment. Now, many people would think that private equity doesn't care that much about sustainability and climate and social, but actually it's going through a big change at the moment, because a lot of its funds are actually demanding that they understand the profile of the investments that they're making. So there's a very, very fast catch-up happening in even the private equity world to do that. And on things like society, I mean, the Fortune 500, we just launched an initiative with them that we're going to add race metrics to all of the Fortune 500 companies, so that actually it's no longer acceptable not to have a good understanding of where you are on racial equality and pay, particularly in the United States, which of course has been another crisis this year and globally. So I am an optimist on this. I do recognize all of the issues Ian in particular raises, and Danny, about social inequality, but I do also think that there is big change happening. There is a big shift. Is it fast enough? Is it quick enough? Question. But there is a huge shift, somewhat triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic, but actually was starting to happen anyway. I think this has accelerated a lot of that shift, but there is a lot further to go. And I think the whole discussion about responsible capitalism and how money is put to work, not just for shareholder return, but for returns in society, is definitely something that has to be picked up, and that is being picked up, but there's a lot further to go. I think global cooperation on things like data standards is incredibly important now, because of course many of these issues traverse borders. Climate isn't, as we all know, something that one country can fix on its own. Neither is biodiversity, and neither are things like the Bangladesh issue around supply chains. That's a global issue of globalization that has somewhat created this prosperity, but also now needs to be looking at, well, how does it create a more sustainable, prosperous world as well?
Yeah. Thanks for that, David. Danny, I'm curious, sitting where you're sitting, actually working every day on the sharp end of a lot of these inequalities, do you hear in that set of trends any clear opportunities that the work that you and others like you do can latch onto? And what does that mean for an agenda for 2021 for the social sector? I'm not asking you to state an agenda for the whole social sector, but what do you think would, what does all of this mean for what we're trying to do?
Well, I think like David, and I think probably all of us, I am optimistic. I think, if if this pandemic has taught us anything, it's that no one is safe until everyone is safe. And that's not just in public health terms, it's in terms of gender equality, in terms of social protection, in terms of climate resilience. And so, if we go back to the point Ian was making about globalization, it's felt over the last few decades that a bit like the Wild West, it's been a sort of free-for-all as global capital expands, particularly in the digital space. And it's almost like we need to catch up with a set of fiscal norms, of social norms, based on solidarity that sort of bring the glue back. I for one don't think you can put the sort of globalization genie back in the bottle, but we do urgently need measures that build an economy and a global system more based on solidarity. And I hope this pandemic sets the sort of scene for that. And I'm optimistic about things like reframing taxation. It's been wonderful to see the work of a group called Patriotic Millionaires, who are incredibly rich people who've come out publicly to call for higher taxes, because they're saying that it's unjust and unfair that wealth, for example, is not taxed as much as it should be. We're at 4 percentage points, I think, of 4% of all taxes are collected today around the world are collected from wealth taxes. And yet we know wealth inequality is a huge driver of some of the inequity or injustice. And I'm also, building on what Livia was saying, if you take what's happening in not just the sort of garment sector, but in other key areas, you're seeing some really interesting moves to not just make those supply chains more transparent, but build that meaningful connection between consumer and producer and everyone in between. And if we start to do that, I think we start to build an economy more based on solidarity. And finally, in terms of social protection, I think it comes back to this notion of how are we going to make the world safer in the long term. Well, if this is an economic crisis as well as a public health crisis, then we need to find better ways for protecting people, manage the sort of livelihood impacts of pandemics like this or other external shocks. And, I think this is there's been fantastic discussions in recent years about universal basic income, about social protection floors, and we are supporting, amongst many others, a new global fund for social protection. We need some bold thinking. Comes back to the sort of imagination that Livia was talking about. What are those bold measures that historians will write about our generation of humans? What are the measures that we will have taken to respond to this very huge disruption to economic and social life? But it's all for the taking. I just hope that our leaders, our policymakers, our business leaders are brave enough to take those bold steps.
Indeed. Thanks for that, Danny. Firstly, I'll just ask all of those listening along, all the participants listening along, if you have questions that you want to add into the conversation as we go into this more free-form space, please drop them into the chat, and we'll include them into in this conversation. But as you do that, Livia, I'll come back to you, right? So, this idea of what are those big measures that will stand alongside the Great Society and the New Deal and other major, and the Marshall Plan and other major initiatives of times past as a signal achievement of this moment is a big question. However, I'm struck, and I think you can talk to this. I'm struck by the fact that I've never seen a fashion CEO or any CEO, for that matter, go on a stage at any major global event and say, we like having near slave labor conditions in our supply chain, or we love the inequality that our business creates because it pays a bigger bonus to me. They may kind of think it, but they would never say it. And they all make the commitments that Danny is talking about. And yet you see very different outcomes between, what is the result for those 5 companies that you wouldn't name that are responsible for the conditions in Bangladesh, or what you see in the diamond supply chain or value chain in Botswana. What, in your experience, is the difference that allows it to translate to the shop floor? What is it that actually allows this type of change to take?
I think there are two different things. There are systems and companies and business models that cannot change without altering the system model. So you talk about fast fashion. You can't name the companies that produce that, but I name them all the time. So you take all the Primarks, the H&M, the Zara, and all that jazz. Their business model is based on producing huge volumes incredibly fast and very cheaply, and turn them around very quickly. So this is a business model which is completely unsustainable for planet and people, but is very, very sustainable for the owners of those brands, who are all, multi-billionaires. Not probably like Jeff Bezos, but very, very close. So that business model, you can't really change it. And as you said very well, they've all been going around for more than a decade on every conference known to earth, pledging and committing to every initiative from any charity or human rights groups, et cetera, but nothing has ever changed. Then you see, because they're not willing to admit that the business model is flawed and they have to change. Wanted to change it, like, Danny was talking about if Jeff Bezos was going to give $100,000 bonus to every single worker, it would still be richer than he was at the beginning of the year. These fast fashion brands could do the same, but they don't want to. Then the diamond industry is very interesting, because what I learned, I've been working in mining for more than 10 years and done many supply chain, whether it's gold or color gemstones or diamonds. The diamond in particular always had a very, very bad reputation. But that is almost like a sector that has looked at itself very, very deeply over the years and learned from their mistakes. So when the famous Blood Diamond movie came out and all the exploitation was revealed, there were very harsh lessons and solutions that the companies in that period, the peers especially, had to take. And they did it. They learned from that. They humbly look at the system and try to look at the solution. So what you have today in Botswana is a system that now has been working for a long time, which, as I said, take into consideration every single stakeholder in that supply chain. And so hopefully the African countries that will want to become less like Bangladesh and more like Botswana, more look at within that continent what works. I know that, for example, countries like Ethiopia have tried to be a new Bangladesh and open to the fast fashion brands. And you have a country that doesn't even have a minimum wage. So exploitation and slave labor is abundance. So we need to look at the system that work and try. I always love the idea that we need a summit about solutions. I want to do a summit where we don't talk too much about the issues. We want to talk about the solutions, what works, and look at every sector and see what are the things that work and how we can become that, create that blueprint.
Yeah. So David, at the risk of making you speak for all of business, something that you said, one of the observations you made, I think, in one of our preparatory conversations stuck with me, which is this, at least in the first wave of this crisis, you did see that businesses that were more dependent on the old way of doing things, particularly big polluters, carbon intensive industries, tended to fare worse than those that were not. And that may be just an artifact of the heavy preponderance of digital platforms at the top of the market. But I am curious, are you seeing the market in any way rewarding, Livia was alluding to, in a meaningful way? It's one thing to say companies are looking at ESG and so on, but are you starting to see any sort of real premium for the businesses that do commit to a different way of doing things, whether in fast fashion or in fashion more broadly or any other sector?
Well, there's a couple of interesting things happening here. And at the same time as COVID, we also had an oil crisis. The price of oil collapsed, and there's various other issues happening. So whilst there was a lot published about the high ESG companies with lower emissions, better social scores, performing much better, and they did, and there's a lot of research around this. Some of it was direct and some of it was coincidental. We shouldn't forget that. But the newer companies that are more technology enabled, and certainly the technology platforms are clearly performing much better in this environment. It is a very unfair crisis. People talk about a K-shaped recovery and which side of the K you're on, so it's discriminatory. Whereas the more traditional companies with heavy industrial supply chains, movement of goods, physical things, they suffered because COVID was more discriminatory on those activities. So I think we have to be careful not to sort of suddenly say, well, that's because of a new thing has arrived and everyone is looking to a new bold future. I think we'd be careful to draw that. But I think there is a big sea change in how companies are perceived. Listening to Livia talk about, some of the fashion industry, and there's nothing they like less than being in the press for having been exposed, be it in Bangladesh or be it in Birmingham, frankly, for having cheap labor, poor conditions, and others. And so we shouldn't pretend this is all in emerging markets. It's actually on the shores as well, as is slavery, by the way. And companies are terrified of being exposed for that. So when we talk about solutions, actually transparency, the media, news, the foundation is unfortunately part of the solution because they can expose these issues. And companies are now spending an extraordinary amount of time and money trying to look down their supply chains and get a better understanding of what's going on. And also realizing that they have to not jump just one step, but 2 or 3 or 4 steps down the supply chain. We've done a lot of work on illegal fishing, which has an issue of around human slavery and biodiversity and illegal fishing, and done a lot of work around that and risk. And it's actually very hard to go all the way through, but you can find it. But there is a fear factor that is happening. The other thing I'll point out too is when we hire, we hire a lot of young people in the world. We employ 18,000 people, over half of which are in Asia. Our average tenure and age is well below 30. One of the most important things they talk about in their interview is our focus on sustainability. I think there's a push from investors, but there's a push from consumers. And there's a push from also employees that actually want to understand who they're working for and why they're working there. And are they leaving the right footprint in the world? And I think if I were to defend business as a whole, which seems to be the way this is set up, I think there is a growing realization that we have to not only deliver to our shareholders, but we have to deliver to the communities that we work and live in. And actually, one thing that's been really positive about the crisis is many companies like ourselves might have said, well, we put our employees and their communities and our colleagues first, but actually we were put to the test. We went early on working from a virtual environment to protect our own people and the communities that they work in, way before the government said. And I think for a lot of companies, they've actually realized that protecting their own colleagues, their employees, particularly those in the front line who not necessarily having the higher paid jobs, has become really critical. I think there's a rebase now going on of what matters and what doesn't. And I'm not pretending that fixes everything overnight, but I do think that talking to all the CEOs I talk to, there's been a reawakening of that impression of what actually matters and a re-understanding of what's important for it. But let's not pretend that competitive dynamic shareholder returns, that goes away. But I do think companies are realizing they have to compete on multiple fronts. And I do see firsthand, because we see the activity, that's part of our business model, companies are spending huge amounts of money trying to get down through their supply chains and understand where the risk is and the reputation risk is, because they're pretty fearful at the moment of any disclosures. The share price impact when this stuff happens is high, and people lose their jobs, and that's unfortunately that's a motivating factor at the moment too.
Yeah, I think that resonates. I think I'll pick up on coming out of the chat. There's actually a question that really goes to a bit of an acid test on this, right? So we now have a vaccine, right? The first of hopefully several. It requires, there's a finite number of doses. that the global system will have to allocate, consider taking into account the interests of Pfizer's shareholders, the national governments of any affected countries, and a whole set of questions around distribution. Danny, you talked about the people's vaccine. We are about to see over the next 3 months the question of how you actually realize a people's vaccine move to the center of the global agenda. How do each of you think about that, right? Whether it's in terms of the supply chain dynamics of it and getting it down to the grassroots, the equity arguments, the nationalism, or frankly, the balance between rewarding innovation with profit and at the same time making sure that a critical product like this is accessible to the people who need it the most. I'll leave it open. So if any of you wants to go first with the view.
I'll jump in, James, if I can. Look, to me, it is an acid test. It's an acid test of what it means to be human. At a moment like this, do we just let the free market reign, that it's whoever's the highest purchaser gets the best supply? Or do we find other ways of building equity into the distribution of something as important, as critically important as a vaccine? And I think, there's a huge support out there amongst people for that sort of notion of solidarity, that it shouldn't be a sort of free-for-all. And I think this will be an acid test. Can our policymakers, can our leaders see beyond national self-interest and use this moment to build greater global solidarity, to show that globalization isn't just about a sort of winner-takes-all mentality?
I can just add to that.
I think there's a number of things which are.
Let's go, David, and then Ian.
The first is. Oh, sorry.
No, sorry, Ian. Carry on.
All right.
Okay. This is the problem with Zoom. You don't see the body language as effectively. I think a number of things jump out of this. The one is that this vaccine from Pfizer was developed by immigrants. Highlight the importance of immigration and all that. The second is that there's a lot of competitors. In Oxford, our vaccine, we've insisting that it's open access intellectual property. And another thing that's coming out of this pandemic is the importance of R&D in the public sector. A third thing that's coming out is that governments can do whatever they want. And although I absolutely agree with David in what he's saying about the private sector moving and some parts of the private sector moving, in the end, it's going to be regulations and rules, the framework that's set by government, that's going to shape the way that societies go forward. And what the pandemic has demonstrated is that they can wave a wand and change their mind. They can suddenly break the orthodoxies that seemed sacrosanct in January. And that's what needs to happen, including on the vaccine. There's big efforts through Gavi, through the WHO to spread it far and wide, but we're going to see it. And more important even than the vaccine is global solidarity. The fact that the rich countries have given themselves $12 trillion in fiscal stimulus and less than 100 billion to the desperate needs of developing countries. Less than 1% has gone. That aid budgets will go down this year because it's a share of the wealth of the rich countries which is going down at a time when it's never been more needed, to me, is the real scandal of this time. So vaccines very important. Ensuring everyone has access to vaccines will only overcome the pandemic when it stops everywhere. But the vaccine is only the health dimension, and the economic dimension, as Danny has highlighted, is even more serious. And until we are able to show solidarity in that as well, we showed much more solidarity in 2008-9 in the financial crisis. There was a much bigger fiscal stimulus. Over 100 countries need their debt written down. There's going to have to be a very big global push, and we've seen none of that leadership from any country. So that, to me, in addition to the vaccine, is the other shoe that has to be put on, and we have to really walk our talk in this respect.
David, a quick note, and then there's a question I'd love to get to after this.
I mean, two quick points following from me. And one is my aspiration and hope following the events last week in the US is that global cooperation, including regulation, I agree with you, Ian, is back on the agenda, and more push. I think two other points. One is the physical distribution of this vaccine is going to be hard. I was reading just last night about the temperature it needs to be stored at and who's got the equipment to actually transfer it. And unfortunately, wealthier countries are going to have that and poorer countries are not. So I think that has to be taken into account. I think governments are getting very excited in making a lot of promises very quickly. But I don't think they've really looked at the supply chain and the distribution and the storage of this vaccine. I'm not an expert, many people are. The other caution I would have is one of the biggest growth industries through this crisis is criminality and fraud and crime. And we saw this, the amount of companies ripping off hospitals and health workers with PPE equipment. I think the fraud has increased by something like 3 times through this period. And so we've got to watch now and have our barriers up for the amount of criminality that will come. I'm waiting for the fake vaccines to appear on Amazon for a price. We talked about Amazon earlier, but just let's watch the fraud of this and make sure that people aren't defrauded through it. But I think that the physical distribution of the vaccine is actually going to be a problem as well.
Great. Thanks, David. And thank you to Sonia Elks for that question. A last quick question, which is actually a blend of 2 questions to you, Livia. And the first one from Fiona Armstrong-Gibbs was around to what extent the crisis of 2008, which killed a whole bunch of smaller businesses in the fashion industry, really cleared the ecosystem for the fast fashion surge that is creating all of these problems, and what might that mean for the hit we're taking now in the global economy, and what new things might come out of that. And then related to that is, as responsible journalism is exposing some of these brands, is there an indication that consumer behavior actually changes? They may not like the bad stories, but do we know that people will say, I'm not going to buy those delightfully priced pants and because of the bad headline? Or do we need to work on the consumer behavior? Maybe a quick reflection on both of those in the remaining minute or so of time.
I think what happened in the last few years in terms of high street is a reflection of what will happen also to the fast fashion brands very soon. And it started to happen already, but because the fast fashion brands, some of them are so big, they're giants, you notice it less. Because if you actually go and look at, I remember a couple of years ago, there was a profit curve of fast fashion brands. And, from 2014, it started declining. So I think fast fashion brands are, their business model is finite and it's gonna, collapse, and it's collapsing already. But in terms of the small independent brands, we have to look at this phenomenon very, very carefully and very closely, because actually, I think now is the time where there will be a huge resurgence of small independent designers, which are not the high street brands. They're the proper, small designers. They work with community projects, and, they have very healthy and resilient supply chains, and, very small and short, because I see the consumer, actually, the famous consumer, which, by the way, I much rather prefer the word citizen, is starting to look at. So I think it will be surprised from 2021 onwards that will be a huge shift, because the polarization between luxury, which has become completely unaffordable and ridiculous prices, and fast fashion, which is ridiculous on the other spectrum. And in between, there will be this wealth and beauty of all these small businesses. And in terms of journalists exposing, I think it's really working. And I think it is changing, and people are really paying attention. I'm not one that pays a lot of attention to, statistics and all these things. The 70% of millennials or Gen Z wants to do this and that. But I actually see it also talking to people and seeing with EcoAge the kind of interaction that we have with our followers and our communities. I see it changing a lot. It's interesting because after the first lockdown, I remember I was so hopeful that during the lockdown, the majority of people would have said, well, we didn't really miss buying things. We missed hugging friends. And so I thought, let's see how that reflects on consumers' behavior. And then I remember reading as soon as the lockdown ended in England that there was a huge queue outside Primark, and I became very depressed. I thought, oh no, damn, I was wrong. But actually, the long-term repercussion of that, I think, is changing a lot too. So I'm very hopeful on both. But we do need journalists, and we, as I said at the beginning, we need the stories. And when brands are not able to tell beautiful stories anymore, people are listening to that.
Thank you, Livia, for that. And to you, Livia, Ian, David, Danny, thank you for contributing to a conversation that, frankly, I think could have gone on for quite a while longer. It's been a real privilege being a part of it. And thank you to all of the participants for all of the questions.